In medieval towns and villages, life was governed by many small rules. These rules were not dramatic. They were not meant to frighten anyone. They were simply ordinary regulations that helped people live together in crowded spaces. The rules covered markets and streets. They covered how people worked and when they rested. They covered the selling of bread and the cleaning of doorways. These were the quiet laws of everyday life. Let us begin with the marketplace, which was the center of many towns. The marketplace had rules about when it could open. In most places, the market opened at a certain hour in the morning. This hour was often announced by a bell. The bell would ring, and then sellers could begin to arrange their goods. Before the bell, it was not permitted to sell anything. This rule existed so that everyone had a fair chance. If one merchant arrived very early and sold everything before others arrived, it would not be fair. So the bell decided when selling could begin. The market also had rules about where people could sell. Bakers sold bread in one area. Fish sellers had another area. Vegetable sellers had their own section. This organization made it easier for buyers to find what they needed. It also helped keep the market cleaner. Different goods created different kinds of mess. Fish, for instance, created strong smells and wet surfaces. For this reason, fish sellers were often placed together. Usually near a water source where tables could be rinsed. There were rules about the quality of goods as well. Bread had to be a certain weight. A loaf that was too light suggested dishonesty. To prevent this, towns kept official weights. Buyers could bring their bread to be weighed. If the loaf was too light, the baker faced a small penalty. This punishment was not violent. It was often a fine, a small payment to the town. The goal was fairness, not cruelty. Ale was another item with rules. Ale was a common drink, much more common than water in many places, because water was often not safe to drink. Ale sellers, often women called alewives, had to follow certain standards. The ale could not be too weak. It could not be sold in unfair measures. If someone sold ale, they sometimes had to hang a sign or a bundle of sticks outside their door. This let people know that fresh ale was available. The sign had to be taken down when the ale was sold out. This was a simple rule, but it helped buyers know where to go. The streets themselves had rules. Streets in medieval towns were narrow. Buildings stood close together. People threw waste into the streets, which made them dirty. Because of this, there were rules about cleaning. In some towns, people had to sweep the area in front of their own home or shop. They had to do this regularly, perhaps once a week. If they did not, they might be reminded by a town official. The reminder was usually gentle at first. The goal was simply to keep the town somewhat clean. There were also rules about where to throw waste. Some towns had designated piles or pits where waste could go. People were not supposed to throw waste just anywhere. They were especially not supposed to throw it into streams that people used for water. These rules were not always followed perfectly, but they existed. They were an attempt to keep life a bit more pleasant. Animals in the streets also had rules. Pigs, chickens, and goats often wandered through medieval towns. They ate scraps and waste, which in some ways helped keep streets cleaner. But too many animals caused problems. They blocked paths. They made noise. They left their own waste behind. So some towns made rules about how many animals could roam freely. Some required animals to be kept in pens during certain hours. Others required that animals be marked so that their owners could be identified. These were simple, practical rules. Work itself had many regulations. Different kinds of work had different rules. Craftsmen, for example, often belonged to organizations called guilds. Guilds were groups of people who did the same kind of work. There were guilds for shoemakers, for weavers, for carpenters, for many trades. Each guild had its own rules about how work should be done. A guild might have rules about how long someone had to train before they could work independently. A young person who wanted to learn a trade would become an apprentice. The apprentice would live with a master craftsman and learn the trade. This apprenticeship might last several years. 7 years was common for many trades. During this time, the apprentice had to follow the rules of the guild and the rules of the master's household. These rules covered working hours, behavior, and the quality of work. After the apprenticeship, a person might become a journeyman. A journeyman was someone who had finished training but was not yet a master. Journeymen worked for masters and were paid wages. They also had rules to follow. They worked certain hours. They produced work of a certain quality. If they wanted to become masters themselves, they often had to create a special piece of work called a masterpiece. This masterpiece showed their skill. The guild would examine it. If it was good enough, the person could become a master and open their own shop. Working hours were regulated as well. In most places, work began at dawn or shortly after. People rose early because there was no electric light. Daylight was precious. Work continued through the morning. Around midday, there was often a break. People ate a meal and rested briefly. Then work resumed in the afternoon. Work ended when daylight began to fade. In winter, this meant shorter working days. In summer, it meant longer ones. These hours were not written down in the way we write rules today, but they were understood and followed. Some towns had rules about working on certain days. Sundays and important religious feast days were often days of rest. People were expected to attend church services rather than work. Markets were usually closed on these days. Shops did not open. This was a time for rest and for religious observance. It was not optional in most places. The community expected everyone to participate in this shared rhythm of work and rest. There were also rules about noise. Medieval towns were noisy places during the day. Hammers rang out from blacksmiths. Vendors called out their goods. Animals made their sounds. Carts clattered over stones. But at night, there were expectations of quiet. People were supposed to go inside after a certain hour. In some places, a bell would ring to signal the time when people should be indoors. This was sometimes called the curfew bell. The word curfew comes from old words meaning, cover fire. It was a signal to cover your hearth fire and settle in for the night. After the curfew bell, the streets were supposed to be quiet. Taverns were supposed to close. People were not supposed to wander about making noise. If someone did walk the streets at night, they might be questioned by a watchman. Watchmen were people who patrolled at night. Their job was to keep an eye on things, to watch for fires, and to make sure the peace was kept. If they found someone out late, they might ask what the person was doing. Usually this was just a conversation. The goal was simply to maintain calm and order. Buildings had rules too. In towns where buildings were made of wood, there was always worry about fire. Fire could spread quickly from one wooden building to another. Because of this, some towns made rules about building materials. They might require that roofs be made of tile or slate rather than thatch. Thatch was dried grass or reeds, and it burned very easily. Tile and slate did not burn. These rules developed slowly, often after a town had experienced a bad fire. The rules were meant to prevent future disaster. There were also rules about how close buildings could be to each other. If buildings were too close, fire could jump from one to another. If they were too close, the streets became too narrow for carts to pass. So some towns had standards for street width and building placement. These were not always enforced strictly, but they existed as guidelines. Inside homes, there were fewer formal rules, but there were still expectations. Families were expected to keep their living spaces reasonably orderly. They were expected to maintain their hearth fires safely. They were expected to keep an eye on children and animals. These expectations were part of community life. Neighbors noticed if a family was struggling. They might offer help, or they might complain to local officials if things became a problem. Trade itself had many layers of regulation. When a merchant brought goods to sell, those goods often had to meet certain standards. Cloth, for example, had to be a certain width and length. This made it easier for buyers to know what they were getting. It also made trade between different towns easier, because everyone used similar measurements. Weights and measures were important. A pound of wool in one town should be the same as a pound of wool in another town. To ensure this, towns often had official weights kept in a public place. Merchants could check their scales against these official weights. If a merchant's scale was wrong, it had to be corrected. This system was not perfect, but it helped create fairness in trade. There were also rules about who could trade. In many places, you had to be a resident of the town to sell goods regularly in the market. Outsiders might be allowed to sell, but they often had to pay a fee. This fee helped support the town and also gave local merchants an advantage. The goal was to protect local businesses and ensure that people who lived in the town could make a living. Some goods required special permission to sell. Items like wine, salt, or certain spices might be controlled. Only certain merchants could sell them. This was partly about quality control and partly about taxation. The town or the local lord wanted to make sure they received money from the sale of valuable goods. So they limited who could sell these items and charged fees or taxes. Taxes themselves were a form of regulation. People paid taxes in different ways. Some paid with money. Others paid with goods or labor. A farmer might give a portion of the harvest to the local lord. A craftsman might give a certain number of days of work each year to repair roads or bridges. These obligations were understood as part of life. They were not always welcome, but they were expected. Roads and bridges needed maintenance. In a world without machines, this work was done by hand. People dug ditches to drain water from roads. They carried stones to fill holes. They repaired wooden bridges that had rotted. This work was often organized by local officials. They would announce when work needed to be done. People from the area would be expected to come and help. This was not paid work. It was an obligation, a form of tax paid in labor. Water sources also had rules. Wells and streams were shared resources. If a well served several households, there might be rules about when each household could draw water. Morning hours might be divided up, with each household having a turn. This prevented crowding and arguments. It ensured that everyone had access to water. Public ovens were another shared resource. In many places, people did not have ovens in their homes. Instead, there was a communal oven where people brought their bread to be baked. There were rules about using this oven. You might have to pay a small fee. You might have to wait your turn. You had to mark your bread so you would know which loaf was yours when the baking was done. These simple systems allowed many people to share one resource. Mills were also shared, though they were often owned by the local lord. If you grew grain, you had to bring it to the mill to be ground into flour. You could not grind it yourself in most places. The lord required that you use his mill, and you had to pay a fee for this service. This fee was called a milling tax. It was one of the many small payments that made up daily economic life. Forests had rules as well. Forests were valuable. They provided wood for building and for fire. They provided food in the form of nuts and berries. They were home to animals that could be hunted. But forests were often controlled by lords or by the king. Common people could not simply take what they wanted from the forest. There were rules about gathering wood. You might be allowed to gather fallen branches, but you could not cut down living trees. You could gather certain amounts of wood for your own fire, but you could not take wood to sell. These rules were meant to preserve the forest and to keep it under the control of the person who owned it. Hunting had even stricter rules. In many places, common people were not allowed to hunt large animals like deer. These animals were reserved for the nobility. Hunting deer without permission was a serious matter. However, people might be allowed to hunt smaller animals, or to trap rabbits and birds. The specific rules varied from place to place, but the general principle was that valuable resources were controlled. Farming had its own calendar of rules and expectations. The farming year followed the seasons. In spring, fields were plowed and planted. In summer, crops grew and were tended. In autumn, the harvest took place. In winter, there was less work in the fields, and people focused on indoor tasks and repairs. Many villages used a system where fields were divided into strips. Each family had several strips of land scattered across different fields. This system meant that no single family had all the best land or all the worst land. Everyone shared in the good soil and the poor soil. There were rules about when fields could be plowed, when animals could graze on the stubble after harvest, and when fields should lie fallow to rest. Fallow fields were left unplanted for a season to recover their fertility. This was an important part of farming. If you planted the same field every year, the soil would wear out. By leaving it fallow, the soil could rest. Often animals would graze on fallow fields, and their manure would help enrich the soil. The timing of when fields were fallow was coordinated across the village so that there would still be enough food. Plowing was hard work. It required oxen or horses to pull the plow. Not every family owned these animals. So neighbors often shared. Several families might own a plow team together. They would take turns using the animals. There were understandings about how this worked, about how many days each family could use the team, and about how the animals would be cared for. These understandings were a kind of informal rule. Harvest time was the busiest part of the year. Everyone worked together to bring in the crops before bad weather came. There were expectations about helping neighbors. If your harvest was finished, you might help a neighbor whose harvest was not yet done. This mutual help was part of village life. It was not required by written law, but it was required by social expectation. After the harvest, there was often a celebration. This was a time to rest and to enjoy the fruits of hard work. But even celebrations had some rules. They took place at certain times. They involved certain traditions. There might be shared meals, music, and dancing. But people were still expected to behave respectfully and not cause trouble. Renting land was common. Many people did not own the land they farmed. They rented it from a lord or a landowner. The rent might be paid in money, in crops, or in labor. There were agreements about how much rent was owed and when it had to be paid. These agreements were taken seriously. If you could not pay your rent, you might lose your land. But landlords also had responsibilities. They were supposed to maintain certain things, like roads or ditches that affected the land. Inheritance of land followed certain patterns. In many places, the oldest son inherited the family land. This was called primogeniture. It meant that land stayed in large enough pieces to support a family. If land was divided equally among all children, it would quickly become too small to be useful. Younger sons had to find other ways to make a living. They might learn a trade, join the church, or work as laborers. Daughters often received a dowry when they married rather than inheriting land. Marriage itself had rules. Marriages were arranged with attention to property and family connections. Parents often had a strong say in who their children married. A marriage was not just a joining of two people but a joining of two families and their resources. There were understandings about what each family would contribute. The bride's family might provide a dowry. The groom's family might provide land or a house. The church also had rules about marriage. Marriages were supposed to be blessed by the church. There were rules about who could marry whom. Close relatives could not marry. There were seasons when marriages were not supposed to take place, such as during Lent. These rules were religious, but they shaped everyday life. Daily routines followed a rhythm set by the sun and the church bells. Church bells rang at different times of day to mark the hours of prayer. Even people who were not priests or monks knew these hours. The bells structured the day. There was a bell for morning, for midday, for evening. These bells told people when to work and when to rest, when to eat and when to pray. Meals followed patterns too. Breakfast, if it was eaten at all, was simple. Perhaps some bread and ale. The main meal of the day was often at midday. This meal might include bread, pottage, a thick soup or stew, and perhaps some cheese or eggs. Meat was less common for ordinary people, though it might appear on special occasions. The evening meal was usually lighter, perhaps leftovers from midday or more bread and ale. Food preservation was important because there were no refrigerators. Salting, smoking, and drying were common methods. In autumn, animals that could not be fed through the winter were slaughtered. The meat was preserved. Vegetables were stored in cool places. Grain was kept in barns. There were practical rules about how to store food so it would not spoil or be eaten by rats. Clothing also followed certain patterns and rules. What you wore often indicated your social position. Rich people wore fine cloth and bright colors. Poor people wore simpler cloth in duller colors. There were sometimes laws about who could wear what. These laws were called sumptuary laws. They were meant to keep social classes distinct. A servant was not supposed to dress like a noble. These laws were not always enforced strongly, but they existed. Clothing was valuable because it took a long time to make. Wool had to be sheared from sheep, cleaned, spun into thread, and woven into cloth. Then the cloth had to be cut and sewn into garments. Because of all this work, people did not have many clothes. They might have one set of everyday clothes and one set for special occasions. Clothes were mended many times. When they finally wore out, the cloth might be reused for something else, like rags or patches. Shoes were also valuable. Many ordinary people went barefoot in warm weather to save their shoes. Shoes wore out quickly on rough streets and roads. A good pair of shoes was an important possession. There were craftsmen called cobblers who made and repaired shoes. Like other craftsmen, they had their own guild rules and standards. Hygiene practices existed, though they were different from modern practices. People did wash, though perhaps not as frequently as we do today. Public bathhouses existed in some towns. These were places where people could bathe for a small fee. There were rules about behavior in bathhouses. Men and women usually bathed separately or at different times. The goal was cleanliness and also socializing in a respectable way. Hair care was part of hygiene. Women usually kept their hair covered with a cloth or veil when they went out. This was both a practical matter and a social expectation. Covered hair was seen as modest and proper. Men's hair and beard styles varied, but there were general expectations about looking tidy and respectable. Illness was a constant presence, and there were traditional ways of dealing with it. Healers, often women, knew about herbs and remedies. They would make medicines from plants. There were understandings about which herbs helped which ailments. Chamomile for calming, mint for digestion, willow bark for pain. These remedies were passed down through generations. They were not always effective by modern standards, but they were the medicine people had. When someone was very ill, family members cared for them. Neighbors might help by bringing food or tending to chores. The community pulled together in times of sickness. There were also expectations about caring for the dying and for handling death. Bodies were prepared for burial by family members. Burials took place in the churchyard. There were rituals and prayers that accompanied these events. The church was central to medieval life. Everyone was expected to attend services on Sundays and holy days. The church calendar marked the year with festivals and seasons. Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, and many saints' days. Each of these had associated practices and sometimes restrictions. During Lent, for example, people were supposed to fast and avoid certain foods. These religious rules shaped daily life. Tithes were another religious obligation. People were supposed to give 1/10 of their produce to the church. This might be grain, animals, or other goods. The tithe supported the local priest and the church building. It was collected regularly, usually after the harvest. This was not optional. It was an expected part of life. The church building itself was often the largest and most important building in a village. It was not just for services. It was a gathering place. Announcements were made there. Community decisions were sometimes discussed there. The churchyard was a common area where people might meet and talk after services. Education was limited for most people. Children of peasants and laborers did not usually attend school. They learned by working alongside their parents. A boy learned farming from his father. A girl learned spinning, cooking, and household tasks from her mother. This was practical education, passed on through daily life. Some children, especially those from wealthier families or those intended for the church, did receive formal education. They might learn to read and write Latin. They might study religious texts. But this was not common for the majority of people. Literacy was relatively rare among ordinary folk. Time itself was understood differently. People did not have clocks in their homes. They marked time by the sun, by church bells, and by the progression of seasons and tasks. Precision was not as important as it is today. Appointments were not made for exact hours and minutes. Instead, people agreed to meet at morning, at midday, or in the afternoon. This looser sense of time shaped daily rhythms. Travel was slow and difficult. Most people never went far from where they were born. Roads were rough. Travel was on foot, by horse, or by cart. A journey of 20 miles might take a whole day. Because of this, communities were quite isolated. News traveled slowly. Events in far-off places might not be heard about for weeks or months. Merchants and travelers who did move between places had to follow certain rules. They might need permission to enter a town. They might have to pay a toll to cross a bridge or enter through a gate. These tolls helped maintain the roads and bridges and also raised money for the town or lord who controlled the area. Inns and taverns served travelers. These establishments had to follow rules too. They could not overcharge travelers. They had to provide reasonably clean beds and decent food. If they did not, travelers could complain to town officials. Innkeepers were licensed, and they could lose their license if they broke the rules. Money was another regulated matter. Coins were made of precious metals like silver and gold. The value of a coin came from the metal it contained. But coins could be clipped, meaning someone would shave off a bit of metal from the edges. This made the coin worth less. There were rules against clipping coins. There were also rules about who could make coins. Counterfeiting was a serious matter, though we will not discuss the punishments here. Different regions sometimes had different coins. This made trade complicated. Money changers helped with this. They would exchange one type of coin for another, taking a small fee for the service. They had to be licensed and had to follow rules about fair exchange rates. Credit and debt were part of economic life. People borrowed money or goods and promised to pay them back later. These agreements were taken seriously. Debts were supposed to be repaid. If someone could not pay, there were processes for dealing with it, often involving community leaders or officials who would try to find a fair solution. Charity was also part of life. The church encouraged people to give to the poor. Monasteries and churches often distributed food to those in need. Wealthy individuals might give alms. This was seen as both a moral obligation and a way to gain spiritual merit. There were expectations that those who had more would help those who had less, at least to some degree. Beggars were a common sight in towns. Some were unable to work due to illness or injury. Others were travelers down on their luck. There were mixed feelings about beggars. Some people gave to them out of charity. Others were suspicious. Towns sometimes had rules about begging. Licensed beggars, those who were truly unable to work, might be allowed to beg in certain places. Others might be moved along or told to find work. Orphans and widows were vulnerable groups. Without a family to support them, they could fall into poverty. Communities had various ways of dealing with this. The church might provide some support. Relatives might take in orphan children. Widows might remarry or find work. There were informal systems of care, based on family, community, and religious obligation. Disputes between people were common. Arguments over property, debts, animals, and many other matters arose regularly. There were processes for resolving these disputes. Often, community leaders or elders would hear both sides and make a decision. The goal was to restore peace and fairness, not to assign blame harshly. Manor courts dealt with local disputes and enforced local rules. These courts met regularly, perhaps once a month. People would bring their complaints. The court would hear evidence and make decisions. Fines were common outcomes. The money from fines went to the lord or to the town, and the person who was wronged might receive compensation. Juries were sometimes used. A group of local people, usually men, would be asked to decide on a matter. They would hear the evidence and give their opinion. This was an early form of the jury system. The people on the jury were supposed to be impartial and to decide based on the facts. Oaths were important. When someone made a promise or gave testimony, they might be asked to swear an oath. This was a serious matter. Breaking an oath was seen as both a legal and a moral failing. Oaths were often sworn on the Bible or on holy relics. This connected the legal system to religious belief. Witnesses were also important. If there was a dispute, people who had seen what happened would be called to speak. Their testimony helped the court decide. Being a witness was a responsibility. You were expected to tell the truth. Contracts and agreements were sometimes written down, but often they were verbal. People made agreements by speaking in front of witnesses. These verbal contracts were considered binding. A handshake and spoken words, witnessed by others, were enough to seal a deal in many cases. Records were kept by those who could write, often clerks or priests. They would write down court decisions, property transfers, and other important matters. These records were kept in churches or manor houses. They were not always easy to access, but they existed as a form of proof. Property boundaries were important in farming communities. Everyone needed to know where their land ended and their neighbors began. Boundaries were marked by stones, hedges, or ditches. Sometimes the whole community would walk the boundaries together in a practice called beating the bounds. This helped everyone remember where the lines were and prevented disputes. Common land was land that everyone in the village could use. It might be pasture where anyone could graze their animals, or woodland where anyone could gather firewood. There were rules about using common land. You could not overuse it. You could not take more than your share. The community watched to make sure common land was used fairly. Rights and responsibilities were tied together. If you had the right to use common land, you also had responsibilities to help maintain it. If you had the right to farm a piece of land, you had the responsibility to pay rent and to keep the land in good condition. This balance of rights and responsibilities was a key part of medieval social structure. Seasons shaped life in deep ways. Spring was a time of planting and hope. Summer was a time of growth and hard work in the fields. Autumn was a time of harvest and preparation for winter. Winter was a time of rest, of indoor work, and of waiting for spring to come again. This cycle repeated every year, and the rules and rhythms of life followed it. Religious festivals marked the seasons too. Christmas in winter, Easter in spring, harvest festivals in autumn. These festivals gave structure to the year. They were times of rest from work, times of feasting, times of community gathering. They broke up the routine and gave people things to look forward to. Fasting and feasting alternated. Before Easter, there was Lent, a time of fasting and simplicity. Then Easter itself was a feast. This pattern of restriction and celebration repeated throughout the year. It was both a religious practice and a practical one, as resources were limited and had to be managed carefully. Weather affected everything. A good harvest depended on the right amount of rain and sun. Too much rain could rot crops. Too little could make them wither. People watched the weather carefully and made plans based on it. There were traditional sayings and signs that people used to predict weather. These were passed down and were part of common knowledge. Animals were partners in work. Oxen pulled plows. Horses carried riders and pulled carts. Dogs guarded homes and herded sheep. Cats caught mice. Chickens provided eggs. Each animal had a role. Caring for animals was a daily task. They needed to be fed, watered, and sheltered. This work was part of the routine. Children helped with these tasks from a young age. A young child might scatter grain for chickens. An older child might lead an ox or help with milking. Work was not separated from childhood the way it often is today. Children learned by doing, and their labor was part of the household economy. Play existed too, though it was not organized the way children's activities are now. Children played games, ran around, and explored. They made toys from simple materials like sticks and stones. They imitated adult work in their play, practicing the skills they would need later. Stories and songs were entertainment. People told tales in the evening, often while working on simple tasks like spinning or mending. These stories might be about saints, about heroes, about local events. They passed the time and also taught lessons and preserved memories. Music was part of life. People sang while they worked. They sang in church. Instruments like flutes or simple drums might be played at celebrations. Music did not require literacy or wealth. It was accessible to everyone. Community identity was strong. People thought of themselves as belonging to a village or town. They knew their neighbors. They worked together. They celebrated together. Outsiders were noticeable. This tight-knit quality of communities had both benefits and drawbacks. It provided support, but it also meant everyone knew your business. Reputation mattered greatly. In a small community, what people thought of you affected your life. If you were known as honest and hardworking, people would trust you and help you. If you were known as lazy or dishonest, life would be harder. This social pressure helped enforce norms and rules. Gossip was a form of social control. If someone misbehaved, people would talk. This talk could shame the person into changing their behavior. It was not always fair, but it was effective. The threat of gossip helped keep people in line. Elders were respected for their experience and knowledge. Older people had lived through many seasons and many harvests. They knew what worked and what didn't. Their advice was valued. Decisions about the community often involved consulting the elders. Change happened slowly. The way things were done this year was probably the way they had been done last year and the year before. Tradition was powerful. New ideas were viewed with suspicion. This conservatism helped preserve stability, but it also meant that improvements came slowly. Technology was simple. Tools were made of wood, iron, and stone. They were made by hand and repaired by hand. A plow, a scythe, a hammer, a spinning wheel. These tools were essential and were cared for carefully. A broken tool could mean a lost harvest or lost income. Skills were passed down carefully. A blacksmith taught his apprentice how to work iron. A weaver taught the patterns and techniques. This knowledge was valuable. It could not be looked up in a book. It had to be learned through practice and memory. Reading and writing, as mentioned, were rare skills. Most people could not read. They relied on memory and on oral communication. Important information was announced out loud. Contracts were witnessed and remembered. This oral culture was rich and functional, even without widespread literacy. Numbers and counting were understood practically. A farmer knew how many animals he had. A merchant knew how to count coins. But complex mathematics were not common knowledge. Practical arithmetic was enough for most purposes. The idea of progress was not strong. People did not expect life to get dramatically better. They expected it to continue much as it always had. This acceptance of the way things were shaped attitudes and behavior. People focused on maintaining stability rather than pursuing change. Security came from community and from following the rules. If you did your work, paid your dues, and got along with your neighbors, life could be predictable. There was a kind of safety in routine and in knowing what was expected. Uncertainty came from things no one could control. Weather, disease, accidents. These were accepted as part of life. People coped with uncertainty through faith, through community support, and through resilience. The rhythm of the day, the week, the season, and the year created a framework. Within this framework, people lived their lives. They worked and rested. They worried and celebrated. They were born, they lived, and they died. The rules and regulations we have discussed were the quiet structure that held it all together. These rules were not exciting. They were not meant to be. They were the background of life, the ordinary expectations that allowed people to live together. They covered bread and ale, streets and markets, fields and animals, work and rest. The details varied from place to place and time to time. But the general patterns were similar. Life was local. Life was communal. Life followed rhythms set by nature and by tradition. The rules reflected these realities. And so life continued, day after day, season after season, generation after generation. The same tasks repeated. The same festivals returned. The same rules governed. This was medieval life for most people. It was ordinary. It was routine. It was the quiet turning of the wheel of the year, marked by small rules and daily habits, continuing on in its own steady way.